Welcome, everybody. Happy Friday. Merry Christmas. We're happy
That's
to
a
be here
pleasure.
with you guys.
Yeah, awesome. Awesome.
Well, I will state unequivocally, for me, this is one of the most exciting and fun engagements that we have. This is my favorite topic, organizational structure and size. So I'm hoping we'll have a lot of really good insights and questions from you guys through our conversation today.
We'll give folks a few more minutes to roll in. Well, thank you, everyone. This is the last webinar for 2024, and we will have one upcoming in January, and I'll walk through these as we get into January. We'd really like you to bring the rest of your teams in on the engineering side to understand some of the technical aspects. The first one in January will be the last one in the business and organization aspect. We're going to shift more to architecture for the following 5 sessions. All right, so today's topic is organization design. I want you to think about some of the structure. I showed the slide quickly. I'm going to go back now and ask for you folks in the chat to put some of the considerations in as you've designed your teams or how your teams are designed today. Put some things in the chat about what you like or don't like about how you're currently structured today.
Region versus global alignment.
Mm-hmm.
Nested levels. Lincoln, I'm curious how deep those levels are. There's deep hierarchies.
Yeah, let's take Lincoln off mute there and ask to describe what are the.
Yep.
Let's talk.
Lincoln,
what about the risk of that?
You're free
and then
to speak. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Philip. You're right.
Yeah. What are the issues of having deep hierarchies?
Some of the issues with deep hierarchies is basically there's like people at the leaf end of those hierarchies don't sort of tend to become disassociated with the organization's goals, and sort of this need to realign. There's a need for a lot of top-down communication.
Absolutely. Michael raised his hand. Question from you.
No, I just had a statement. Like in my opinion, the problem with like deep hierarchies is that the more finite your job responsibilities get, the less your job really means, right? So like if I hired somebody as like a person who has a manager, and then that manager also has like 2 product owners, and then those product owners have 6 developers under them, and those 6 developers have 6 junior developers under them, at a certain point, like you've diluted the work to the point where what's anybody really doing other than like the smallest portion possible, which in some cases is good, but in most cases is just dead weight.
Yep,
Precisely.
absolutely. Good. You're jumping right ahead.
Yep.
And Madan, you said the inverse pyramid. What are the risks of having that structure?
Not enough growth opportunities.
Yes.
Mentor, and then have an organization of growth.
That's a great challenge that people hit. In my own personal experience, you wanted to have senior people to do the heavyweight work that a senior person could do. But when those senior people left, either to another promotion within the environment, within the company where I was, or even worse, when they left, there was a large gap.
Yeah. And Charlene hit another one that's a kind of similar way of stating the hierarchy one or the deep nodes, just a lot of cross-team dependencies between the teams, the product teams, and the platform teams. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's get into it. So as you grow your teams, if you got to start over from scratch, or if you get the opportunity to go to another organization to change the structure, or if you're in a position today, these are some of the factors that we want you to consider. And I think you've hit a lot of those there. The first one is just the communication of the proper communication when necessary, and always erring on more frequent as better, but also the effective timeliness so that you can close the loop between the actions, the goal there being time to market. You know, how fast can you release features or capabilities or improve availability that customers actually recognize? And these other ones here, I think you spoke about streamlining workflows. That touches on the cross-team dependencies here. Standards, we didn't discuss too much yet, but it helps with the creation of standards. How much do you want to have teams understand centrally versus provide some decentralization? Ownership is a good one there. Where you lack clarity. If you have the everyone owns it, yet no one owns it, then that's something we hear in a lot of our clients that are later stage companies. And of course, quality. And then lastly, just coordination. That's similar to communication efficiency, but it informs the amount of information. So one of the mathematical theories we want you to understand or think about is communications theory. This is that top-down coordination you spoke about here earlier, and it's very similar to when you have to broadcast some message. It's similar to this the way that light is emitted. As you move further and further away from the distance, the quality of understanding the message as it was originally intended, that decreases. It's an inverse square law. It's 1 over the distance squared. So think of each R here as a layer in your organization. There's that many chances that the message gets diluted because it's dispersing itself among those teams. So the more layers you have, the more the message that's intended from top down typically gets diluted, or it needs to be retransmitted and reinforced. I don't know how many of you grew up in an era of actually getting over-the-air TV, but I grew up in an area where the nearest broadcast TV station was a 3-hour drive away, and they had repeating transmitter stations to get that to the next 60 miles or even the next 30 miles, though. So you had to have these retransmissions going forward, though. Is anybody old enough on the team to have over-the-air TV, or maybe you still are trying to do it by cutting the cable today and recognize you're outside of your broadcast zone? Any show of hands of anyone trying to use over-the-air TV? Yeah, very good. All right. So
I
that's
had 3 stations available to me when I was a kid. So if I can ask a question, really one of the comments that I would ask, this does represent clearly the hierarchies, the levels of hierarchy within your organization. At the first R you see an A, that A is the message. Take it to the second and third level. Can you ask someone in a sub-team of a sub-team what A means? And are they able to rationally and correctly articulate what A means? What is the message? That's an easy way for you to check whether the communication is coming through your organization or not.
going back to the TV one. Somebody else mentioned 3 stations. We had 4. Some of you may have been fortunate to have PBS was another one that was broadcast as one of those, but it didn't come in as clear as the major 3 networks. So another question here, and this one's a little different now in the era of COVID, but think of companies that originated even since COVID. How many of them do you see as successful where the teams were geographically separated? Can any of you think of a company that was either started pre-COVID or post-COVID where the teams were not in the same location? Zoom as a company getting started? Yeah. And GitLab also.
Yeah.
What are some of the reasons you think Zoom and GitLab were actually able to be successful in spite of the teams being geographically separated?
They probably have teams that even though they span time zones, they are still one. So they're probably running squads or kind
Yeah.
of tribes or guilds across geographies.
Do you think that guilds were operating in different time zones, or that they met in the same time zone?
So maybe they met and whenever the time zones overlapped.
Yeah, absolutely. So we don't discuss this here. We'll get into this in some of the technology things, but just plant that seed now of synchronous communications as being that live time that you're interacting versus asynchronous communications of when you're not interacting, and the benefits and cons of both of those approaches. Because in some cases you want synchronous communications, real-time communications, where everybody can hear and listen and make sure everybody gets the same message, versus asynchronous, where the message can get relayed and passed on and passed on and passed on. So keep that in mind. We're going to discuss that in the next 2 sessions coming up from a technical perspective, though. Very good from David there about how did those teams operate. Absolutely. All right.
That comes from a common, very clear sense of communication, a vision from the beginning.
So location, we still, even post-COVID, generally like this view on the left side here where teams are co-located. Well, we call them full stack teams. They're not full stack engineers, but full stack teams where you have everybody together delivering features versus splitting up the product teams from the developing teams. And sometimes you can't avoid that, but it's considered the next best option. And then the last one is when you split folks up in different, when you have even more separation between the dev lead and the PO. Because the risk in this one here is the communication between the dev lead and the PO designer. If everyone's virtual, then you're trying to operate more in this model on the left here. Just by show of hands, how many of you have the most of your team remotely distributed where the majority are not in the same location?
A lot.
Wow.
Good. Not surprised, but
Yes.
surprised.
Yeah. Quick question for one of you that first added, I'll call out Christopher. How do you think you operate now compared to pre-COVID from a collaboration standpoint and knowledge transfer? Because in some cases I could see an improvement, some cases a less desirable outcome.
I'm assuming you mean me.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So our we haven't really changed. We've always we're hybrid, but like my team, with the exception of one individual, is all local. So we do, actually pre-COVID we were full time in the office. Actually, that's not true. So I'll say actually, I think it turned out better now, the hybrid approach. So we do 2 days in the office, and then Monday, Wednesdays are in the office, and those are like our high collaborative days where we do like most of our meetings, although they seem to lurk on the days where we are remote. Although I always stay in the office. I like coming to the office, but it's really close to my house. As opposed to where we were always full time in the office pre-COVID. But I think the hybrid approach now that we have, like I said, we take our collaborative days, get our meetings, get things organized, go over the big objectives for the week, any blocking materials that they may be depending on, and then the remote days are where we try to get that time where we're not getting distracted, minimize the context shifts and stuff like that. So, but I'm fortunate where like the majority of my team, but we're also a small company, are all located in the same city or can get into the office twice a week, where I just have one individual who's fully remote right now that comes in about like once or twice a quarter.
Very good. So would you say that your communication has perhaps got more consistent and professional because you're in this hybrid model than perhaps you were before? Did you rely on more ad hoc communications, or do you think you're... Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say our communication strategy now is more focused, only because we know, like, for the main reason that like we're taking these opportunities, we're gonna have these meetings. I have taken a lot of effort into operationalizing the meetings, right? So like making sure like, okay, if we're gonna have a platform team meeting, like there's always an agenda set ahead of time where whoever's in that meeting is going there. So we I'd say now with this hybrid model, we've become focused and very operationalized with that time, as opposed to your point beforehand. We're always in the office, and it just became kind of like, I don't know, you're just pulling people in at any moment, right? Like I need something, I'm just going to go over here and get it, vice versa. And I think it just led to more waste, so to speak, because we were losing, I don't know. I realized I looked like we are just losing time because everybody had to stop, and it was just the context shifting. And then in a smaller company too, you have a lot of people who are kind of wearing multiple hats, so they're kind of working on, the main project that they're working on, but sometimes they might be doing something else as well, as I say, a side project or something that we're trying to like, prototype or think about. So, but then like if you gotta stop and answer, 20 questions in a day, right? You're losing, what's the research say? You're losing anywhere from like 15 to 30 minutes by the time they gotta stop, answer that, and then when they go back to, then reset themselves to get back on their work. So I think we've just been more focused, and actually we became more operationalized. Although I always think we could be more operationalized. Some people can't stand me, but yeah.
If you're if you're the leader, you definitely have that tendency to want to operationalize more. Absolutely, because you're still that hub of information. So very good. So just to add to this, we talked about the theory about how with technology, some things can help with the non-time sensitive. We still would like to see the live communication, and that can ultimately lead to what we call innovation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about innovation after this. So just thinking through this, we talked about this, about the organization structure. We talked about hierarchies versus deep hierarchies. Some of the risks that we talked about here that generally they tend to be static, and they're resistant to change. And I won't ask the questions why on this one, but I think most of you understand people that are at these layers here, they've gotten promoted to those layers. And so they like having that ability, that control, and it can be a career change if, for example, you flatten the organization structure, uh, but you do have a sense of having some long range perspective, but what each individual can do generally becomes less important because you've divided that work up. So we've really discussed this one before. And we'll get to this innovative question here about how many companies you think operate this way versus a flat one where you can adapt quickly. You're generally more tolerant to risk. It is harder to micromanage because, as you stated earlier, you have multiple hats to wear. You tend to have more of a short-term focus, but it really requires high performers in this model here because you wear multiple hats, because you have to operate quickly. So that is one of the challenges of a flat hierarchy. You do have to hire and develop stronger people that are generally more well-rounded there. So just some considerations there. We're going to recommend more the flat hierarchy where as much as possible. I understand for many of you that are in larger companies, they've grown through M&A. And so that is also a big change where you've got the the acquiring company is generally that top-down structure. The company that's smaller that's acquired is more of that smaller structure here versus the rigid one. And so there's always a lot of challenges integrating those companies when you do M&A activities.
Philip, can you go back?
Yeah.
Two primary differences.
This
When
one or
you
this
get
one?
the flat, there you go. When you get to the flat structure, two primary differences that are there. People at a lower level of that organization understand the long-term vision and direction of where you're going, and perhaps even more importantly, you've delegated the decision capability down to a level where they can make the decisions operationally on what they're doing. That's part of what we're going to talk all the way through today.
All right. So as we mentioned, if you're running a modern SaaS company or a modern e-commerce company, a flat structure is a better choice. If you're operating something that doesn't change much, you need a lot of control. For example, a nuclear reactor or near the power industry, you typically want that tall structure because you want to have a lot of controls in place and you don't need to respond as dynamically to market conditions. So from a triangle here, just when you download this and read this later, there's really three different triangles you're trying to optimize. It's similar to the good, fast, and cheap model, if any of you have seen that. But the top is time to develop, get to market quickly. At the bottom left is what's the cost to develop. And on the far right is really what the market needs. If you're operating on the right side, that's where you have that cross-functional optimization between how can we as quickly as possible meet the needs of the market versus on the left side, if you're operating more functional, you're more focused, you can operate and focus on cost to develop and time to develop. So you generally get different types of folks and different needs. And you can read this at the bottom here of where you typically are. So if you're a company that's at the late end of a market cycle, you're probably on the left side. You're trying to squeeze costs out of your organization. If you're on the right side, you're generally focused on trying to grow your market, growing quickly. You're trying to become a market leader and be ahead of your competition versus on the left side, you're more of a fast follower. So if you look at your competitors in your market, think of yourself, are you more on the left side or the right side? And I would suspect many of you that are not in startups are probably operating on the left side if your company is more than 10 years old, if not 15 years old. So think of that as your organization grows over time. It's not just how well you want to structure it, but what's the right fit for your market based on where you are. So we'd like to see you understand both of these, but generally we're going to focus more on the right side of growth oriented. All right. So we'll get into the meat of this now, which is organizing teams for faster market and higher innovation. And I'll give you a bit of the background here. Peter Drucker, for those of you that don't know him, wrote a important paper, and if not a book, I believe in the 70s or 80s. And his book was, Why is it that large companies can't seem to innovate? And why do most small companies, they're the only ones that seem to have innovation? So I'll ask the question there for you. Why do you think large companies do not seem to innovate? And you can answer in the chat. Yep, too much process. High value predictability. Yep, risk averse. I'm going to ask another question. Yep, slow decision making, slow pivot, hard to learn. Yep,
Good.
bureaucracy, very good. Who are the exceptions to this? And we've identified one here for some of you that may not know this one. But what are some other exceptions you can think of? It's a large company that continues to innovate, and we say continue. That's a big I, innovate, which is by the definition is creating a new market or being way in advance of others in their market. Apple, Meta, Amazon, Netflix, Tesla. Exactly. Big tech. Well, would you consider Oracle an innovator today?
There we go,
Yeah.
Nicholas.
Yeah. But
open your mouth and speak to us.
Yeah.
We're with you. Big tech is certainly an innovator, but are they reinventing what's already there, or are they creating something new?
And every big company was an innovator at some point. They did win in some market, but generally companies like Oracle tend to grow via acquisition at that point, and they become smaller. Dan's exactly right. They tend to acquire the innovation. Yeah, exactly. Let's get into some of the reasons why that's the case. Jeffrey Moore wrote the book Zone to Win, and he identified that a lot of companies, what happens is there's too many conflicting interests as you grow that they tend to disrupt innovation. And so it's by actually being, if you, the more that you manage something, the more likely you are going to stifle that innovation. So what makes you successful as you get bigger, you generally want to be more risk averse and not take as many bets. So it's very difficult for big companies to support innovation internally because the internal controls tend to stifle that. And Clayton Christensen really wrote more about that in his book, Innovator's Dilemma. It's that the reason that good management is that if you're a good management company, good at managing, you are generally not good at innovation because they're conflicting in most cases there of how that's taught. A lot of companies started following the GE model, leadership model back in, I think, the 80s or so, and that's been in vogue. And you still see that mindset in a lot of companies today that started in the 80s, continuing to operate almost 4 decades later in that mindset. It's all about good management processes. And again, most of those tend to disrupt, reject disruptive technology. We mean disruptive is it's going to compete with a core part of their business. That's when you look at these, in his books, they describe something that could crowd out your market today is most likely something that would tend to get squashed internally. So what we found through our research is there's a few companies, those big ones, and there's several things they have in common that cause them to continually innovate versus the other big ones that are risk averse. And we'll walk through these, but the high level ones are the size of the team, how they're constructed, how long they're together, how they're aligned, if teams are empowered. And the last 3 here, we're going to shift some of that content to the discussion in the new year around OKRs, but how to come up with a unifying and compelling vision, the culture of success, and playing offense and defense. We're going to defer that. We're going to cover most of these today, but until the folks like Apple and Amazon, Drucker's law of innovation generally held true that big companies don't innovate; they acquire innovation. Exactly as
right
Dan
in line
said
with what Dan said. Exactly.
in the chat. Exactly. So let's get through team size here. How many of you have large teams today?
Larger than 30 people.
And we'll get into that definition. That's an overall organization. I think I would almost call that a department. How big are just things that just a single team that may have just a single manager?
Between 15 and 30.
50, yeah. Do any of you have teams that big? Where one manager is that big a span of control?
7 to
Yeah.
10. Excellent,
Yeah.
Marie. That's fantastic.
Very good.
6 to 9, Christopher. Fantastic also. You guys will see why here in a few moments. 10 to 12.
Yeah.
Fantastic, Madan. 7 to 8. This is great news.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot
Lincoln,
of you are
pleased to see
following
that.
that model. Yeah,
Yep.
you're converging on a similar size, and we'll get into the
There's
theory
some
behind that.
there's some beautiful human mathematics that echo and reflect why your teams are that size.
Right. So how many of you have heard about Robin Dunbar? Show of hands. Yeah, very good. We have a quick video here. You'll recognize the overlay voice that walks through this, but it's going to play out and explain a bit of the team size, what is the ideal size, and why. And hoping the audio works.
Welcome to AKF Partners' continuing series on notable personalities that impact business and technology. Today we ask, who the heck is Robin Dunbar? Robin Dunbar is a British anthropologist who, in the 1990s, found a correlation between primate brain size and the size of the primate's average social group. Primates in the wild express a very highly social nature. They maintain a close personal contact with other members of their close social group, especially through daily social grooming. These tight-knit social groups function as protective cliques within the larger physical groups in which the primates live. The number of social groups a primate can track and maintain appeared to be limited by the size of their neocortex. Dunbar used his observations of primates to suggest a theoretical social group size for humans. He arrived at a mean group size of about 150. Dunbar's further surveys of villages and tribe sizes also appeared to approximate this mean group size at 150, but only for communities with a very high incentive to remain together. The group required a commitment to physical proximity and protection, as well as a dependence on one another for subsistence. Think about your travels to a village or a rural small town at a distance from a large city with 120 to 150 citizens. Consider your own interpersonal relationships, your family, close friends, business associates, and your acquaintances. Humans maintain very close, intimate relationships with only a small few others. Our interactions with our acquaintances are either purpose-driven or surface-level conversations. How does Dunbar's theory apply to determining team size in a modern software product organization? While corporate teams do not usually depend on one another for subsistence or for protection, they do depend on one another to get their work done. A software engineering team may rely on services and data provided by other teams. They surely depend on a technology team to provide the infrastructure on which their software resides and runs for their customers. That engineering team also depends on the productivity and participation of its own members to complete its goals. But how large can such a team be and remain successful? A second consideration arises from Mel Conway, who stated that each individual must have at most one superior and at most approximately 7 subordinates. A team of 4 people entails 6 lines of communication, 1 line from each individual to every other member of the team. A team of 6 entails 15 lines of communication. A team of 10 entails 45 lines of communication. One can mathematically describe this phenomenon where n is the number of people within a team, and the number of lines of communication is calculated as n times n minus 1 divided by 2. As the number of team members grows, the amount of time spent coordinating activities with the rest of the team increases. With very large teams, more time is spent coordinating than working. There is, then, a theoretical tipping point where a team becomes too large to remain productive. Combining these thoughts and theories from Dunbar and Conway together, we arrive at an optimal team size of no more than 12 to 15 people. We see this naturally borne out in sports teams like American football, soccer, and baseball. We also see it in military units or squads, and anywhere concise communication is required for proper functioning of a team. Smaller teams, focused on common goals and in close proximity to each other, benefit from natural human connection with all the verbal and nonverbal cues. Just like a small network within one building, co-located teams communicate with low latency. Big teams, particularly when dispersed over distances and time zones, must deal with slower, more challenging communication. From a practical sense, that brings us to the conclusion popularized by Jeff Bezos at Amazon. If you can't feed a meeting with 2 pizzas, it's too large. Consider 2 large pizzas. You can imagine your own toppings. Each of them sliced into 16 pieces. If each person were to eat 2 pieces of pizza, you could feed 16 people. If each ate 3 pieces of pizza, you could feed a team of 10, with some left over. The key takeaways for team size. Elite teams should be small, no larger than 12 to 15 people. High-functioning teams operate best when located in close proximity to one another. At AKF Partners, we have discussions on team size with our clients regularly.
All right. So, Christopher, a question.
Yes.
What is your question?
Oh, wait. Oh, no. Sorry. I thought you were asking me a question. I forgot my hand was up. I'm sorry.
Yes.
That was a
All right.
mistake. Carry on. My
No
bad.
problem. All right. So we'll leave the slides here for you. It walks through the video. It's a little faster to skim through them, but it walks through Dunbar's numbers, Dunbar's layers there.
You can find our video on our website or on our YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Just a little plug.
Yep. And we put here the theory, the mathematical formula. Doug, I know I sent you that Excel file, and if you're able to share that with folks yet, or if we can maybe put it afterwards, but
I'll share it, and I'll make sure that we put it out for everybody.
yeah,
If you'd like, I can share right now, but the functional graph is already on the screen for you.
Yeah.
Understand the number of people you have dramatically increases over time, over the extension of people, the number of communication points you've got, which is mathematically, I think the beauty that I pull from that is that natural human communication is focused around sports team size, squad team size. We have consistently over many, many centuries figured out the biggest team size that makes sense for us, and we build organizations around that.
Yeah, 11 seems to be the number in the biggest sports for a team size, 11 at a time. I understand football has different sides, but that is the upper boundary. And if any of you have played sports in that level, even that's difficult. You tend to get specialists where some parts cannot communicate easily with others in those situations. So a lot of you have gravitated more towards the 6 to 9, and that's really the sweet spot of team size. When you get to the upper end, it gets much more complex. So once you get over 10, we said 12 to 15, that is the red. You're in the red zone up there. I would say yellow is just below that, and green is the one that most of you put in there from 7 to 10.
8 was the max as a rower.
Yep.
Awesome, Chris. Thank you.
Very good.
That was also due to boat size.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's talk about team construction. And I'll ask the question for you, and we'll give you the background here. Was the invasion of Afghanistan in the first initiative. And when we first invaded, when I say we, the U.S. invaded, it was a small team of special forces. They were able to take over the entire country within, I believe, 12 months. Is that right, Doug? Even less than that?
10 and a half months.
10 and a half
Start
months.
to finish.
Yeah.
53 individual special forces teams effectively overtook the governmental control of a country in 10 and a half months.
And then we brought in the full forces, hundreds of thousands of troops were brought in over time and were not as successful, but some other group that was there displaced a group that was already there. So what is unique about why were they able to operate so efficiently before versus the larger organization later? Any questions any thoughts from those in the chat? What makes the special forces so effective compared to the traditional forces? Co-location or
Coalition.
coalition? Okay.
Coalition meaning focused attention on a specific goal. Am I interpreting correctly, Lincoln?
No.
No? Okay. Give me more clarity.
You can come off mute if you want.
Ah, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Decentralized command.
Mm-hmm. Yep. T-shaped. Very good.
Yep.
Exactly.
Michael hit it perfectly. Small team size. You had one, maybe two people who could do every special thing that was required within the team, but the team was fully autonomous and capable within itself.
Exactly. And that's actually what made the Taliban successful in pushing out. They had the same team model. So we'll walk through that real quickly here. So highly innovative teams generally follow this model. And the special forces teams that went in had 2 of all these skill sets, and they decided there were 6 skill sets that were needed: leaders, medics, engineers, weapons specialists, operations and communication specialists. But the idea was that they could operate for extended periods of time behind enemy lines. That is the autonomy. And of course, the 2 times people is for redundancy.
Redundancy.
Exactly.
You're going to lose, unfortunately, in warfare, you lose people along the way. Hopefully, we're not losing people along the way in operational product companies.
Exactly. And remember, these folks are mission oriented. That was a big part of the special forces team. We call this the tyranny of the how. And we get some mixed answers when we ask this question, and you just can answer with one of these 2. What's more important for you teams, what you produce or how you go about producing it?
Outcomes.
Yep.
What you produce. In disagreement with David. David says how.
Yep. Dan, I'll let you go first, and then David, I'll let you go for next. Dan, why outcomes?
I think in my experience, the outcomes are always more important than how you got there. We talked a little bit about technical debt in an earlier session, and it's always a balance of how quickly can you get it to where you need it to be, and then knowingly taking on some of the technical debt pieces as well. How it gets there, I don't think anyone really cares in my experience.
David, there's a strong argument for how. What's the argument for how you go about producing it?
I took the question in the context of, if I can set up a process that tells us how to produce an outcome that we want, then it's repeatable and reproducible. I wasn't looking at it in the context of, get this widget delivered, right?
Yeah.
And not how, right? I was trying to think of it from a process or consistency perspective. So that's why.
Got it.
How.
Okay. Very, very understandable. Christopher, question?
I just want to chime in too. I didn't add anything in chat. Sorry. Those meetings are working on me. Everyone keeps slacking me, even I set my calendar to do not disturb. I feel like it's like a loaded question. Like I feel like it depends on where you're at, maybe with your product, right? I feel like if I'm early stage, I just care about what I produce because I'm just trying to get something out there, and I'm not necessarily worried about how. But if I have something I think the last commenter, if it was Dan, my apologies, I messed it up. To his point, right? Like, I feel like the process is important because you now, like at this point, you might have a stable and you have users and you want to keep those users. Just speaking of like a technology type piece of application, obviously, since we're all technologists here, that how is important because you want that process. You want to understand how are these CI pipelines, CD pipelines working, and you want to control that stability, right? You want to have quick throughput, but you not at the cost of, making your system unstable. So that how becomes really important. So I feel like depending on where you're at, there's a different focus.
Yep. So we'll get to this in the next.
Add a little bit?
Yeah, go ahead,
Christopher,
Doug.
you walked us beautifully through early stage to mid to late stage, and the transition, the whole focus around this, how do you maintain the innovation? All of those constraints that you added in can begin to constrain your innovation as well, and that's what we're trying to protect.
Yeah, and as you grow, you have different outcomes that you're trying to achieve. As early stage, your outcome is trying to identify market fit. And then later on, you're trying to improve availability. That's why you want that consistency. But you also want to continue to have fast time to market to respond and adjust. And
Yep.
so you're going to have potentially competing priorities. That's why the next session we cover outcomes and key results is very important, how to manage that. We're going to focus it back on how do you still operate on this small team model, but still have this right balance of what you produce versus how you go about doing it. In general, we like to set up the teams so that they're more focused on what you get done, but let the team figure out how they get done. And if you can measure them based on outcomes, that's helpful. But if, for example, if team A did the same thing differently than team B, there might be some cost structure differences. But if you're looking for similar costs, similar output, you generally shouldn't care unless you start to see some things that are problematic in aggregate across multiple teams there. But in general, we tend to, as you tend to go up in the organization, as you get more responsibility, we'd like to see you delegate more and let the teams figure out on their own what gets done. Let them be accountable for what gets done and not as focused on how they get it done, as long as they get it done as you want. So the way that works is you tend to have these more cross-functional teams where you have multiple skill sets. A lot of you on the call tend to have the internal folks, the developers, but also the designers working closely, and the product owners and quality, so that you can make sure that all of that's getting done the right way, because you've got the right skill sets that focus on it. They worry about the how to get it done. So we're going to walk through this model here. You're going to see some slides here. What this comes from is a PhD paper that one of our founders wrote when he retired the first time, went back to school. He was almost done getting his PhD in computer science, decided to switch to business. And his research paper was on why do small teams continue to innovate. So this is part of his paper. We're going to walk you through some concepts here that there's two kinds of conflict that go on in any organization, within a team and across a team. And there's cognitive conflict versus effective conflict. So cognitive conflict generally is focused on what you want to do, why you want to do something. And effective is generally tends to be more role based conflict, and it tends to correlate with time to market, but also indirectly with levels of innovation. So folks tend to worry about, who should get something, and ownership, that in some cases can slow things down. So we'll walk you through these dynamics as team structure, how you organize your teams, more so than by how they're the size though. So you're going to see some colors. We'll explain it here. Green is the direction. The plus is it's a direct benefit. It grows something, versus a -1 is the minus sign, and the red generally is a negative outcome. Green is generally a positive outcome. So for those of you that are red-green colorblind, I apologize. Hopefully the narrative will walk you through this here. So generally we want cognitive conflict is beneficial to innovation here. So as that increases, generally the level of innovation, it's really where you're focused on the outcome. Like, how do we win this part of the market? How do we capture this part of our customer journey, as an example? Or how do we go about cutting the time of our delivery from A to B? That's what we call cognitive conflict. It tends to be creative discussions, and you might have some competing interests, but because people are aligned on the same outcomes, generally that's good with respect to innovations. You don't focus as much on the how, and so it's focused on what we'll do and why we should do those things. So that's a positive benefit. Empowerment also helps with that, and it's the inverse of that, of empowerment, is delegation. So delegation does not equal empowerment. We'll discuss this later, but if you tell a team you're responsible for this outcome, but you're not given the resources, you truly haven't delegated. So the team isn't empowered. The more empowered a team is, they are more wedded to the outcomes. That generally increases time to market. Quality generally improves too if teams are empowered. We also like to see experientially diverse teams, and this is the back to the point of folks that have different skill sets because they bring different mindsets to the table. Someone focused on quality generally thinks through all the things that will break at some point. DevOps also are thinking that way. What's going to possibly break? What's going to wake me up in the middle of the night? Product folks tend to think about where's there going to be friction in the user experience or adoption. The more skills you have that are experientially diverse, the higher levels of innovation, though. Now, over time, though, that can be a challenge. The team tends to get more groupthink at some point. But early on, if you have everybody with similar skill sets, groupthink really dominates in the early ones. That causes negative innovation. Effective conflict that we described is generally about whose role is what. That's my responsibility, not your responsibility. That generally stifles innovation, and it can also reduce morale. Teams tend to become disengaged at that point. So that's when it's focused on, too much focus on the how versus the what. Another thing that tends to impact negatively in innovation is organization boundaries. That's what tends to lead to these responsibilities. It's the handoffs between different teams. And if you've seen the traditional waterfall development, or requirements are done by one team, then maybe some mock-ups are done by another team, then handed off to an engineering team, handed off to a QA team. All of those boundaries tend to cause this effective conflict. Not my responsibility. You should have done that. All of that tends to stifle innovation.
The silos.
The silos, yes. Another one that tends to increase is what's called network diversity. The network diversity is related to, do the team members have loose relationships with people outside of the core team for ideas? And if any of you have read the Steve Jobs book about Apple, he was known for this. He was known for meeting with a lot of people and having ideas. He was known for, if some folks would come and give him an idea, he would say that's a terrible idea, but then he would go and resell it for someone else. But he had this loose network of a lot of folks where he could tie these concepts together. So the more that your team members have a diverse network outside, the more likely you're going to bring the innovation into your organization and your team. So that's what the network diversity means here, is how many loose ties do you have? That's where you're going to have higher numbers than the core team. The core team, we talked about 6 to 9 people, but this can be in the hundreds of people. The more people you know loosely that you can share ideas, bounce ideas off of, the better.
It's not just the CEO that can have a network. This is intended to be down to the individual engineer.
Yeah. So putting it all together, we talked about a lot of organizational boundaries, increased effective conflict, which we don't like. Effective, experientially diverse teams generally increases cognitive conflict, but it can also sometimes cause effective conflict. So it's just something to be aware of because of the backgrounds that could cause some responsibility within a team of, that's my decision versus your decision within a team. Overall, from innovation, empowerment positively impacts that. Network diversity positively impacts that. Cognitive conflict definitely increases that. You will always have some kind of effective conflict that's going to slow down the team. So that's the math behind all of this here. Any observations from the team before we move on to the exact one here, the next topic? Team duration. So how long should teams be together? I'll ask that in the chat, and we're going to go through this content fairly quickly.
2 to 3 months, 2 to 3 years, 2 to 3 weeks. Trent says as long as possible.
I like that. Why the 2 to 3 months? And what do you mean by that? I can't remember who said 2 to 3 months. I didn't catch it in the chat.
That was me. I was just throwing out ideas. Sorry,
okay,
man.
Good. Okay, very good. The reasons we say that is it's the Tuckman's phases. Many of you have heard this, the forming, storming, norming, performing. And that goes back to a paper written in 1965. And most of us take this for given that this is a common framework. But as you go through the stages, it takes a while, and this walks you through the dynamics of each one. But the 4 stages performing, This is one of the reasons we tend to want to avoid project-based work, where you go bring teams together for a certain amount of work, have them disband and go somewhere else. We typically find that it takes at least 2 months for teams to get from forming to storming to norming. And we like to see folks avoid that. That's the risk of project-based work. If you have projects that are, say, 6 months long, you're potentially wasting the first 1/3, if not more of that, just going through these phases. You're very inefficient. We like to see teams together for 2 to 3 years if possible, but we don't like to see the exact same team members together for more than 2 to 3 years, because groupthink does tend to sink in. Now, we're not saying disband the team entirely, but start changing the composition of the team members, start swapping them out. You will have natural attrition there. Go ahead, Dan. Was that your voice I heard?
Oh yeah, I was just agreeing with you. I'm just, a lot of my background is in the consulting space,
Yes.
and completely agree. You'll have natural just transition within the team, but you definitely don't want group think is a big killer for sure.
Yeah. We're in the consulting space. Our total organization size is under 20 people. And so it makes it easier for us to work very quickly together. Also, we don't have a lot of diversity in what we do work-wise. That makes it easier. Yep. Pharma reorgs, consistent reorgs, that just is going to kill the company. Absolutely. Reorganization too many times.
My experience there is that people start to duck. Reorgs mean in many cases a layoff, and people start to really insulate themselves and duck away, and innovation becomes unimportant. It's preservation over innovation.
Yep. And these recommendations here are around continual innovation. If you're not in the continual innovation space, if you're trying to decrease work, or you truly are having to do project work, which you will have to do at some point, this doesn't apply. But in general, if you want to continually innovate, move work to teams. Teams will figure it out. The teams are small, but don't necessarily form teams around work unless it's something new and very, very urgent. If you do, they're going to go through those norming stages. The last one is around team alignment and how teams are structured. And this all goes back to Conway's Law, which was popularized by Fred Brooks. I won't go into the history behind that, though, but it was all written around that what you design is typically a copy of the organization's team structure. And Fred Brooks observed this in the Mythical Man Month, that it's the design that comes first is almost never the best one, because the point of it is, over time, if your market changes and you continue to have the same team structure, the same team structure will keep creating the same kind of system based on how they were organized, not necessarily what meets the needs of your market or as you grow. So the important here is, as you change your architecture, you need to constantly be thinking about your organization structure. So you will, in this case, need to start reshaping your teams while adhering to the other ones we've talked about of keeping them small. That's one thing we see a lot of people miss, is as the organization grows, does the architecture change? And vice versa, as the architecture changes, is the organization changing? Those are, as you grow, you need to constantly be keeping those in mind and linking those together. And this is the history behind these points, that the organization architecture are intrinsically linked. With those layers in your organization, that means you're less flexible and less likely to change your design. And that means your architecture is less likely to evolve with that. We always make mistakes, and it changes. So you have to organize quickly to fix those mistakes. If you don't keep those linked, your product and your market fit will be at risk.
Another short advertisement. We've got a second video that covers this same topic at a high level, if you want to share it with someone else around you.
Exactly. So design the architecture and team in parallel. Too much organizational depth hurts flexibility, and no design is perfect. We're going to stop here today with empowerment. We discussed it earlier, the difference between delegation and empowerment. That's what these slides are. And we'll wrap up here, though, and then we'll pick up at the next point in early 2025 with OKRs, which is focused on how do we align on the same outcomes. And that's going to be the focus of our next session, though. Any questions here from the team? We can go just a little bit over, but we schedule these for an hour. But we can leave questions in the chat, or if anyone wants to raise their hand. Go ahead, Christopher.
I just wanted to say, no question, just thanks for
You bet.
all the resources. I really appreciate it. It's really enlightening and helpful. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to do these sessions with us. So thank you, and happy holidays, and and see you all in the new year.
Happy holidays. Charlene, do you have a question?
Around Conway's law, somewhere along the way, I think I read something about a reverse Conway maneuver. Do you have any advice on, how to manage in this area?
Reverse Conway, meaning that you change your architecture and form your organization around it, or the other way around?
Yeah, I don't remember all the details. I just remember reading about it. So I was wondering if you had more details about what is that reverse maneuver? Like there's a technique I had read about once upon a time.
I've heard that and not read about it, but I assume it's about unwinding
Yeah,
these.
can I?
Go ahead, Trent.
Yeah, it's Chris. Sorry, Charlene. Yeah, I actually,
Pleasure.
I've read a lot. I did a lot of research on all these materials that Phil and Doug has shared for us today. Yes, the reverse Conway maneuver is essentially so Conway's law is saying that companies typically structure their information systems or their technology around how the company communicates.
Correct.
Right. And that's problematic because that goes to like a lot of the things that Doug and Phil were trying to say, like you want to steer away from. So the reverse Conway maneuver is implementing the things that they were going over today, where you want to structure your teams around how your software communicates, right? So there's a really good book that touches this, Charlene, that I read that I think this might be helpful for you. It's called like Team Typologies by like Matt Skelton, and I forget there's a second author, and I'm drawing a blank on his name. But that goes on it. But like the idea is like you want to create like streamed aligned teams, right? Where there's a constant flow, but it's this collaboration mechanisms of where you're designing your teams around how the software essentially communicates. In short, I know we're over time, so I'm not going to talk. I could talk forever about this. Feel free to link me in if you want, and I've elaborated. But that's essentially the gist.
Exactly. Team topologies is exactly that. And we're going to cover a lot of similar content when we get on the architecture side and then tie it back to the risks of that and how do you split up the architecture and then still adhere to this small team model. And we're getting ahead, but that's a big problem with a monoliths. It has too many people in the same code base, and you've got hundreds of people all trying to coordinate. So even though you may structure into say 10 teams of 6 people, if they're all working in the same code base, they're still productivity wise the same as a team of 100 people because the architecture has tied those together. And the same occurs when you buy software too, not just build software. Trent, did you have a comment or question?
Oh, I was just going to do the TLDR and the reverse Conway maneuver is essentially the reverse. So
yeah,
spike out a brand new architecture, the way you ideally think the software should be structured to be most beneficial for your products or your organization.
Yep. And then build a team.
Build the teams around those modules or delineations.
If you took nothing else from their conversation, that's the lesson. Awesome.
Very good. All right, everyone. We will see you next year. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll get into OKRs, the common missteps and mistakes, and some techniques how to create them the right way. So very good, everyone. Have a happy new year.
Same to you. Thank you, guys.
Thank
You
you.
bet.
Thanks, everyone.